Hi, welcome to LACNETS. My name is Lisa Yan. I'm the Program Director at LACNETS, and this is Lindsay Judavine, the Director of Communications. So we just wanted to welcome you to today's webinar, and the topic is what matters most. Our speaker is Judith Redwing Keyssar. Her friends and family and most people know her as Redwing. So throughout the webinar, you'll probably hear us refer to her as Redwing. So some logistics, first of all. If you're unable to hear us, you might want to hit the mute button to make sure you have sound coming out of your speakers. And you can enlarge the screen. And just a reminder that our video will be available in a few days on our YouTube channel. We also have an exciting announcement. Our annual conference set on Saturday, June 20, will be a virtual conference. So we'd love to have you join us then. All of our questions for today's webinar will be taken via Slido, S-L-I-D-O, and Lindsay will also put that in the chat box so you can see it as well. So please ask your questions, and we will have extended time of questions and answers. We also want to thank Rich from AVP Live for making this webinar possible, as he's behind the scenes taking care of us today. Our next monthly meeting will be on Saturday, July 27th, and our speaker is Dr. Eric Liu, who all of you know. He's a friend of ours. He's a NET specialist, and the topic is going to be sequencing of NET treatments. This is really important for those of us in the NET cancer journey, as this is a question that comes up all the time. If you're newly diagnosed, the question often is, what do I do first? And then later on in the journey, we often wonder, well, what's the best order of treatments or sequence? What do we do next? Is there a best way to make those decisions? And so we've asked Dr. Eric Liu to come and speak to us, and that will also be a webinar, which will be Friday, July 27th at 12 noon Pacific time. Speaking of newly diagnosed, and even for those who are later on in the journey, a wonderful resource we have available is NET Vitals, which is something that Giovanna and I created along with Dr. Dan Lee from City of Hope. It's available on our website, lacnets.org/netvitals, and it's both available in a fillable PDF as well as a document you can print and fill out on your own. You'll have to save it on your own desktop. It is not something that we save or keep. And it's a document that you can really go through and see what gaps of understanding you might have, and also see those areas that it might be a refresher, so you get to know your own disease a little bit better. These are the basic 20 questions that are really important, that are what we call the vitals. To put you on the same page, to talk to NET specialists, and also to bring to NET providers who may not yet know you if you're going for a second opinion, or you end up seeing a new physician, a new provider during this season. It's a great resource during this pandemic. If you find yourself unexpectedly at a hospital, you might want to carry this with you and have this available so that new providers will know a little bit about your NET disease. We have lots of resources on our website. We have blog posts that we release regularly. We have a page for the newly diagnosed. We have quizzes, and our recent quizzes have been going along with the NET Research Foundation's podcast, which we encourage you to listen to and then take a quiz to test your understanding of the content in the podcast. Just a reminder, we're on all social media channels, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. So we encourage you to follow us and sign up for our mailing list as well. We just want to acknowledge that we're all in different places with different needs, and it can be helpful to connect individually or in small groups with others. And to that end, we have a couple things available to you. One resource we have is health coaching, which is an opportunity to connect one-on-one with a licensed, national board certified health and wellness coach to focus on self-care and how you might thrive despite living with cancer. And that's available to patients and caregivers in the Southern California region. It's also helpful to connect with other NET patients and caregivers and learn from each other's experiences. And to that end, we have a weekly support group meeting, which normally is on Wednesdays, but this week we're meeting tomorrow at noon instead of our regular day Wednesday, since today's Wednesday and we have the honor of having Redwing here. We also have Net Connect, which is a mentor buddy program. So if you're looking to connect with someone, whether it's you're early on in the disease and you want to connect with someone a little further on, or you'd like to connect with someone who's had a certain type of treatment that you're wondering about, we're happy to connect you with someone. So you can email us, info@lacnets.org, or you can email me, lisa@lacnets.org, and we're happy to connect you. So before I introduce Redwing, I wanted to share a little bit about my own story and what this topic means to me and why this is important to me. As many of you know, my husband is living with neuroendocrine tumor of the cancer, neuroendocrine tumor of the pancreas. And back on January 2nd, 2015, when all this started, I found myself in a really shocking and scary place. I was standing in the ICU next to my husband of almost 10 years, and he was on the ventilator very unexpectedly. I was told he had big tumors, which we later found out was neuroendocrine tumor, and these tumors were causing life-threatening issues. So at that time, I had to make some really big decisions and sign consents for scans, biopsies, interventions. And even though I was a nurse practitioner and spent years on the other side having those exact discussions with patients about advanced directives and about making big decisions, I never expected to be in that position myself under the age of 40 with a husband that was otherwise healthy, who had never ever been to the hospital before, who had never had signs. We had no warning, and this completely came as a shock and out of the blue. So we got through that really difficult time, and after we got home from the hospital, my number one priority was completing our advanced directives and power of attorney, which we did within 24 hours from the time we got home from the hospital. We now carry pocket advanced healthcare directives cards with the names and phone numbers for the people we chose to make decisions for us in our wallets, so that we always have it available. And we've had many discussions about what's important to us, what matters most, and how we want our decisions to be made. So we've learned firsthand that we need and want to be better prepared for the unexpected things that can happen. It's less traumatic that way. It's also empowering. And to have advanced directives and designated decision makers can be like a handrail for really difficult, unexpected seasons. So fast forward to today, I'm going to introduce Redwing Keyssar, and I just wanted to explain how I met her. I had heard quite a bit about Redwing through Giovanna, our former executive director and friend, as Giovanna had reconnected with Redwing after she moved up to Marin last October. They had lots of mutual connections, and when she moved up there, she took a What Matters Most Advanced Directives workshop with her in San Francisco. And when I flew up to see Giovanna in what would end up being her final days, Giovanna was gushing about Redwing, and she shared about her meaningful conversations with Redwing and how important they were to her, and how the very practical advice and insights that Redwing offered her really were so valuable. And as I sat and held vigil at Giovanna's bedside over those last few days, I read Redwing's book, Last Acts of Kindness, Lessons for the Living from the Bedside of the Dying, which really spoke to me. And I have the book here. I had the pleasure of meeting Redwing the day after Giovanna passed, and I shared with her how my dream was for her to come and share her insights and experience with our LACNETS community. And because not only is she an amazing person and writer and speaker, but a friend of Giovanna's, and she knew her personally, this would be very meaningful to all of us. So I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Redwing and to have her here today. Thank you and welcome.
I certainly wish I was there in person as we had originally planned to be with your group in a live session, because I always prefer to actually see people's faces and bodies and interact that way. But different world right now, so this is what we have, and I'm happy to be here. And yes, I am so honored to have known Giovanna, even in the little ways that I did. Of course, I first knew her as a musician, not as someone with cancer. And her music brought great joy to me and to many, many people that I know. So in her honor, I am especially happy to be here. And probably some of you in this group also knew Mary Isham, who was someone else with neuroendocrine cancer, who also knew Giovanna, and who was just a powerful advocate for all kinds of cancers and people with cancer. So today we're going to talk about what matters most. We're going to talk about advanced care planning, why it's important, what it is. We're going to use this document that I believe was sent to everyone. A copy was sent to everyone. It's called a California Advanced Healthcare Directive, and it was put together by Dr. Rebecca Sidori here at UCSF. In an attempt to make a document that was really in simple language, was understandable even to people who were not highly educated. And I've used this document in workshops for the last year, and people seem to like it almost more than any other document. However, I want to start with the poem that I always read at the beginning of every in-person session, and now that I'm only doing online sessions, I'm doing that also. And it's a poem called Otherwise by Jane Kenyon. I got out of bed on 2 strong legs. It might have been otherwise. I ate cereal, sweet milk, ripe, flawless peach. It might have been otherwise. I took the dog uphill to the birch wood. All morning I did the work I love. At noon I lay down with my mate. It might have been otherwise. We ate dinner together at a table with silver candlesticks. It might have been otherwise. I slept in a bed in a room with paintings on the wall and planned another day just like this day. But one day I know it will be otherwise. We do advanced care planning because we all know that one day it will be otherwise. We also, when we have conversations with our friends and family, we think, can't we talk about something more pleasant? But the truth is, this is part of life. As The Onion tells us, the world death rate is actually holding steady at 100%. Now, regardless of all the latest headlines about COVID and everything else, the plain truth of the matter is that none of us gets out of here alive, whether we have a disease now or don't. We are mortal beings, and we live in a society that really does not talk about serious illness, does not talk about death and dying. It's pretty death-phobic culture. And so most of us don't grow up being comfortable with conversations about what might happen at the end of our lives. And yet what's also true is in those of us in healthcare, we can't follow your wishes if we don't know what they are, if we don't know really what matters to you. I am a nurse who has been in healthcare for over 30 years in oncology and critical care, in hospice and palliative care. And I have learned over time that one of the biggest gifts we can give to ourselves and to our loved ones is to have these difficult conversations. So, what is an advance directive for healthcare? So, an advance directive is basically a legal document that states our wishes for what we might want or not want, um, and also names someone who can speak for us if we can't. Part of the confusion for people, I think, is that there are so many different documents and different names for the same document. So, an advance directive for healthcare is the same thing as a power of attorney for healthcare. Some people call it a durable medical power of attorney. Some people think that because they've done their trust and done some estate planning, that they've done a completed advance directive. And sometimes they have, but oftentimes when you do one in the context of other legal documents, you don't get to dive as deeply into what an advance directive for healthcare really should be and really should say, which is what we're going to talk about today. So the main things, again, is that it states your wishes and it names someone to speak for you if you can't. In the olden days, back in the early 90s, there was a document called the Living Will, which allows people to state their wishes. It's still a living document, but it doesn't allow you to name someone to speak for you, which is what an advance directive for healthcare does. So, why is it important to have one of these? Well, none of us ever knows when a medical emergency might happen. You know, as Lisa just told us her story, there she was, a young woman married to a young, healthy man who ended up in the emergency room not knowing what was going on with him. These kind of things happen. When I first started doing this work, understanding that this was my work in life, was back in 1987 when my best friend was in a motorcycle accident and she lay in a coma in an intensive care unit for 3 weeks. And she was 30 years old. I was 35. And no one expected 30-year-olds to die back then. No one expects that they're going to be the one to end up in an emergency situation, in a critical care situation, unable to speak for ourselves, and with a lot of difficult decisions to make. So it's really important for everyone to have an advance directive for healthcare. It's really the most clear way to ensure that whatever wishes you have about how you want to be treated in a time of a serious illness, not even necessarily at the end of life, but if you were hospitalized and couldn't speak for yourself, that there's something in writing and that we know that you've had conversations with your friends, your family, your loved ones about what really matters to you. It's also an incredible way to reduce stress on the people that you love, because having this in place really means that you've thought about this and that the people who are going to speak for you really understand that their job is to speak for you, not just to do what they write. So this is the basic document that I'm going to be referring to today in terms of the language that this particular advance directive for healthcare uses. It comes from a website called prepareforyourcare.org, and there's a slide at the end that will give you the information, and I believe that LACNETS has provided you with the links for this also. Prepare for Your Care is an amazing website of resources around advanced care planning. You can get this document in multiple languages. There are videos on the website to help you have conversations, to help people understand why it's so important. And again, Dr. Rebecca Sidori, who created this, did years worth of research and groups to figure out what was the best way to do this. So I really highly recommend this document. You also fill it out online. You can download it from the website. It's just a great tool. The two most important things are choosing your decision makers and then letting them know what decisions you want them to make. So it's really important to think about who of your family friends is going to be willing and able to make decisions for you if you are unable to. And this is really about understanding a lot about yourself. I think one of the key things that I often caution people about in terms of choosing your decision makers is to think about who is going to be the strongest advocate for you. If you're in an emergency situation, if you're in the ER or in the intensive care unit and you can't speak for yourself for whatever reason, either you're too sick, you can't physically speak for whatever reason, your decision maker has to be strong enough to follow your wishes and really advocate for who you are and what you have said you wanted. Oftentimes people assume that their spouse, their partner, their oldest child is the obvious person to be their decision maker. What I ask you to think about and really consider is, if the person who's closest to you emotionally is going to be having a really hard time seeing you in that kind of critically ill situation, maybe they are not the best person to be your primary decision maker, because maybe they need to just be at your side and hold your hand and allow themselves to feel whatever they're feeling in that moment, and not have to be the one to kind of put their emotions aside and stand up to the medical team and say, no, I'm the decision maker here. We need to discuss this. Being an advocate in a hospital situation is difficult under good circumstances. So you really need to think about who are the close people in your life who you think have the ability to be a strong advocate for you, not just who loves you the most, who can really for you. Sometimes it's best to have your best friend who may not be quite so emotionally attached and who can be a little bit more objective to be your primary decision maker, and then have your closest person either be listed as your secondary, or maybe they can have equal power in making decision. You can even have a third person. We'll talk about this as we go on, but you can also add things. Any of the documents that you use as your advanced directive for healthcare, you can use a standard form, but you can add things in. On this particular advanced directive, there's a whole blank page where you can add in information. In my advanced directive, for instance, there's a line around the decision makers that says they need to at least contact my brother who lives in Boston, who's not one of my primary decision makers, but I want them to keep him in the loop about any decisions that might need to be made. So you can add things like that into these documents. You don't have to just fill in the forms or just check the boxes. And I think that's an important thing to remember. So the critical things about who your decision maker is: they have to be at least 18 years old. You will to be able to have a very in-depth conversation with them about your wishes. You need to know if they really can show up and be there for you. I often get the question, does it have to be someone local? Can it be someone far away? And of course, now in this day and age of cell phones and Zoom calls and Skype and everything else, um, of course, we can reach people anywhere. Um, but I always think it's helpful if at least one of your decision makers can be someone who lives near you, who could show up in person at the hospital. I just think it makes a difference. And as I said, whoever your decision makers are really need to be strong advocates. You need to trust that they're going to follow your wishes and that they understand that their job, when they say, yes, I will be your decision maker, isn't to say, I'll do what I think is best. It's really to say, I know what you want because I've had these conversations with you and I will follow what you want. You have to trust that they understand all your medical information and that they're not afraid to speak up, that they're not afraid to talk to the doctors, that they're not afraid to really say, hey, we need to have a family meeting here. This is important. And in terms of knowing yourself and communicating this with your decision makers, part of your conversation needs to be about what kind of flexibility you want to give them. Are you somebody who feels like you trust this person implicitly and you want to give them complete flexibility that if something happens and they're in a conversation with the doctor and they feel like they need to change a little something about your decisions, that's okay with you? Some people said, I want to give my agents a little bit of flexibility. It's okay to make some decisions just in your conversations with your doctors, but maybe there's one or two things that I am absolutely clear. No, you can never change this. And then you can write that in. These are my absolutes. Or you can say, everything in this document is my absolute. You do not have flexibility. And part of this is, how do you like to make decisions? Are they always just on your own? Do you like to gather input from other people? Um, do you prefer that your doctors make decisions for you? These are all important questions to ask. Um, One of the social workers who I often used to teach advanced care planning workshops with would talk about how when her three children each turned 18, she gave them a voter registration card and an advance directive for healthcare. Because in our society who's an adult needs to have thought about these decisions at some point in their lives. I want to just pause for a moment here to see if any questions have come in, if there are any specific things about who your decision maker should be, or what questions come up for people around that you would like to ask right now. Otherwise, end of this PowerPoint and talk, we will open it up for more questions. But I'm just wondering if any questions have come in already.
Um, I think this is really helpful, and I'd love to go over some of the questions that at least are on my mind as you're going through your discussion. I really appreciate you just saying that no one expects these things to happen, and no one expects to make those decisions, as you and I have been in that situation.
Right.
So just kind of want to go back and touch on a couple things for clarity,
Sure.
because advance directives can be a complicated thing. And I know a lot of people will say, well, but I've done a financial power of attorney. And so is that the same thing? And is that the same person?
Good question, and a common question. So no, it's absolutely not the same thing. Again, typically, when you've gotten your paperwork in order, it includes a power of attorney for healthcare and a power of attorney for finance. Yes, you can name the same person as your power of attorney for finance and healthcare. If you absolutely trust that person, that's totally fine. And oftentimes it makes it easier, and there's some obvious person in your life or people in your life who are going to take care of everything at the end of your life. But they're two completely different documents. The advance directive for healthcare, as we'll go into a little more in these next slides, is really just about what happens to you in terms of medical decisions, treatments, both during your life, while you're sick, at the end of your life if you're seriously ill, and also after you die, that your power of attorney for healthcare has the ability to make decisions about that also. One thing that I encountered some years ago, with a patient, is that she was an elder in her 80s, and she had named two different people. She had named her partner of many years as her agent for healthcare directive, and she had named her sons as her powers of attorney for finance. And they did not all get along with each other. And when it came time to make decisions about the level of care that she needed, that needed to get paid for and had some financial ramifications, there was a fight about the sons not being willing to pay for the level of care that the partner who had been with her for 40 years felt she absolutely needed. So I just, it's something to think about. If you're giving different people powers of attorney for different things, to make sure that those people are all on the same page and have the same understandings from you about what's important to you.
Okay. So it could be the same person or it could be a team of people. Great.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And, I really like, and I've heard you say this before, the social worker who hands her kids the voter registration and the power of attorney at age 18. But that brings to mind, well, how often would I need to update this? If someone's doing it at 18 years old and they name certain people, but the relationships change, like you said, the family members that don't get along, or, situations change. Say you named an elderly parent who 50 years later, they've already, passed away. Well, how often do I need to update this?
So, what I usually tell people is that if you're under 50 and you're absolutely healthy, look at it every 5 years. If you have a serious illness, and or you're over 50, I would really try to look at it every 1 to 2 years. I mean, as you say, things change. I mean, these are living documents, and they change, as we get older, as we have diagnoses, as people in our lives change. The person who you trusted implicitly at 20 or 25 may not be the same person at 40 or 50 or 60. People come and go in our lives, things change. And I know that for me, in 2013, when I was first diagnosed with ovarian cancer, I had a very clear set of directives that were part of the addendum to my own advance directive. And then when I had a recurrent cancer in 2018, I made a lot of changes to my advance directive that I could not have anticipated. So it has to be a document that changes as you change, and that the conversations we have with our agents have to be ongoing and part of this review process.
Yeah, very true, very true. And we see a lot of changes, especially during this season with the pandemic and all this uncertainty. That's very true. So, I mean, we're talking about a document, but is it something that we can just talk about? I mean, does it really need to be in writing? And maybe you'll be getting to this soon. But maybe,
Um,
is it something that we
yes,
could
yes
just,
to it.
okay.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, both things are critical. The
Mm,
conversations with the people who love and care about you are absolutely critical. And again, have to be fluid conversations that happen over and over again. But the importance of having it in writing and having it be a legal document has been proven over again. You know, some of you are too young to remember Terry Schiavo and some of those kind of cases that were in the public eye at different times. One of the cases I used to use a lot was a man named Robert Wendland, who was 40 years old, who, you know, basically his father had died in an ICU. And after his death, he said to his wife and his kids, you know, don't ever let that happen to me. I don't want to be hooked up to machines. I would not want to live that way ever. And 6 months later, he was in a horrible car accident. And he did need every kind of life support and had just to keep him alive. And his wife told the doctors that it was time to stop. And his mother flew across the state and contested it and said, you can't do that. You can't take him off of machines. You're killing him. And he lay in what we call a vegetative state for the next 8 years while the courts battled who had the legal right to make decisions. And at the end, he died of pneumonia on the ventilator. And the judge finally said that had anything in writing documented, none of that would have happened, and there would not have been all that suffering. So making these documents legal is just, it's so important in terms of alleviating suffering, not only for the person who is sick, but for everybody who cares about them.
Yeah, it's a gift, like you say, for our loved ones.
It's
And
a huge
yeah, you mentioned this is a living document. So does that mean that after any changes we make, it would have to get notarized again?
Yes, yes, that's true. And I'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end. Should we go on to the actual decision?
Yeah.
As I said, there's two things that are critical to doing these documents. There are many other pieces that are really important, but the two most critical things are naming your decision makers and then telling your decision makers what kinds of treatments or procedures that you want them to be able to choose for you. What's important to you, you know, and again, if you have clear ideas or feelings about any kinds of medical treatments, you need to talk about it and you need to write it down. Now, not we knows a crystal ball. None of us knows exactly what's going to happen. But thinking about the kinds of things that could happen is important so that our decision makers know where you are kind of on that spectrum. So, you know, would you want CPR if your heart stops and you stop? Would you want to be put on a breathing machine or a ventilator? Studies around this country tell us that most people understand what it means to be on a ventilator by what they've seen on television. And now, let me tell you, being an ICU nurse for as many years as I was, it does not look like what it looks like on television. It does not look like ER or whatever the latest healthcare show is. You know, George Clooney does not show up at your bedside, and you don't like look great when you're lying there in a bed on a ventilator. And I even had someone in one of my advanced care planning workshops recently. Well, doesn't being on a ventilator just mean that you have a mask on your face for oxygen? They didn't understand that when you are hooked up to a machine, that means that you have a tube down your throat into your lungs, and that tube is hooked up to the machine, and the machine is breathing for you because you cannot breathe for yourself. It's a very challenging situation to be in, and typically we have to people not only pain medication but some kind of sedating medication when you are on a ventilator, because most initial reaction is to pull that tube out because it's not comfortable. It's something to really think about. You know, what kind of situation would you be willing to be on a ventilator? And certainly now that we have ventilators on the front page and the headlines of news all over the place, people are hopefully understanding a little bit more about what that means, and how traumatic that can be for people. But again, it's important to think about. In the old days when advanced directives first came into being, everybody thought that if you checked that little box that said life support, it really only meant whether you were willing to be on a ventilator or not. But in truth, there are a lot of decisions that we consider life support. You would want to be on dialysis if your kidneys stopped working. If you can't swallow, would you want artificial nutrition and hydration? Would you want it just while you were in the hospital? But if you really weren't going to ever be able to swallow again, um, would you want what we call a peg tube, placed into your so that you could have ongoing artificial nutrition and hydration? Would you want blood transfusions? Would you want surgical procedures? All of these are just things to think about, for who you are. Would you be willing to have these treatments or not? And to have that be part of the conversation with your agents. So part of this is really about how you balance quality of life with good medical care. One of the things it asks you in this particular version of the advanced directive is, if you are so sick that you might really die soon, what is your preference? Would you want to try all life support treatments? Would you want to stay on them as long as possible because just being alive is that important to you? Would you want to do a trial of life support? It's okay to say in your advanced directive, I'd be willing to support for 2 weeks or whatever seems reasonable to you, or no, I don't want to try it. I don't want to even try that at all. Again, when my original addendums to my own advanced directive said that, like, if I was in a car accident and my lung was punctured, I'd be willing to be on a ventilator for a couple of weeks to see if my lung healed. But after 2 weeks, then I wouldn't want to anymore. But when I had a cancer recurrence in 2018, I really thought about it and I realized I don't want to be in an ICU on a ventilator. So I changed my advanced directive at that point. So again, we change over time. We change with what happens individually. We change with the experiences that we have in the world. And one thing I'll say here too is that, obviously today we're kind of doing an overview. It's not like I'm expecting that all of you who are watching this webinar are sitting there filling in the pages on the advanced directive. But I really encourage you to do that, and there'll be a link at the end of this PowerPoint that I am doing online kind of in-depth advanced care planning workshops these days, where we spend 2 hours one week and 2 weeks later going over all your questions and all your concerns for your particular advanced directive. And you are welcome, certainly, to join any of those sessions. And, one of the things we do during those sessions is talk about, what does quality of life mean for each one of us? What are our lines in the sand of, like, no, if I can't do that, then life isn't worth living to me. These are all things that are just important for us to think about. Usually, this is people tell me they want to avoid. This is not how they want to be for any extended period of time. And it's certainly not how or where most people say they want to be at the end of life. This is more where people want to be at the end of life. They want it to be peaceful. They want it to be ideally serene. More and more people are talking about the spiritual aspects of aging and illness and death and dying. I'm always amused by this. I actually took care of a woman who was 53 years old, and when she was at the end of her life, dying of a metastatic stomach cancer, she lived in a place that looked exactly like this, in this valley, in these beautiful green rolling hills in Northern California, in a community of people who just did an exquisite job of taking care of her. And she was a single mom with 2 young sons. And she had gotten very clear about what her wishes were, even though it was really hard for her to have these conversations and to put things in writing because she was so young. One of her sons was autistic. She was the only one who could really communicate with him. She was just too afraid to have patients. But at the end, she was so happy that she did because everyone around her understood what was important to her was being in a peace and having the people that she loved care for her in very specific ways that were important to her. It's important for all of us to think about what matters most in your life. What does bring you joy? What are you looking forward to the most? I had another patient a couple of years ago. He had a chronic lung disease. He was in his early 80s, but he knew he was going to die of this lung disease. And he was an advocate for anybody who had lung disease and anybody who had serious illness. He was a big advocate for doing advanced care planning. And was a Keyssar patient, and the Keyssar actually has a great advanced directive document that anyone can download from their website. And one of the questions they ask is, what does a good day look like for you? And he had written down that a great day for him going to this restaurant that he loved up in the Napa Valley and sitting on the hillside, drinking martinis with his friends. And so in July, this was, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, when he knew that he was really declining and was likely going to die within the next couple of months, he invited his family and his close friends and went to that restaurant in the Napa Valley and had a beautiful day together and fulfilled his dreams because he had dared to say what his dreams were and what was important to him. You can make an advance directive as simple as you want, but you could also write down as many details about what really does matter to you that reflect how you've lived your life, what your values are, what's been really important to you, and how you want to be taken care of when you're seriously ill. We don't like to talk about these things, but it makes a difference. It makes a difference when we consider for ourselves, what does quality of life mean for me? What are the most important things that I want the people around me to understand? Um, I think these are the kinds of things you need to ask yourself. And when we do write down more specific things in our documents, it also allows the healthcare team who's taking care of us to have a little more insight into who we are. For anyone who's been in a hospital in the last 20 years, you understand that the doctor who shows up at your bedside is not your primary doctor, is not your oncologist usually, it's the doctor who's on duty that day in the ER, in the ICU, even on the floor as the hospitalist that day. They're not people who know you, who have seen you over months or years, who understand some depth about your emotional or spiritual life. They're seeing what's in the chart. And if you've written something more specific about your quality of life and what's important to you, and they see that people understand, oh, this person has put some thought into this, and I understand a little more. This is someone who loved to be out in nature, who loved to go hiking, who loved to be swimming in the ocean. Maybe that's going to tell me a little bit about what kinds of treatments I offer if there's not someone who really wanted to be in a hospital very much. So these are all things for you to think about. So again, this is taken from the advanced directive document that was sent to you, asking you at the end of life which of these things would make you want to focus more on quality than on quantity of life. And again, these are just questions to consider. If you were at the end and you weren't going to wake up from being in a coma, would that be one of those critical times when you would say, no, that's not what I want? I would rather focus on quality than quantity. If you weren't able to bathe yourself, to take care of yourself at all, if you had severe cognitive impairment or some kind of dementia and couldn't take care of yourself, how would that affect your decisions about quality versus quantity of life? If you're in really severe pain, would you rather focus on comfort, or would you still say, hey, just do whatever you can to keep me going? These are important things to think about. And for some people, they're willing to say, hey, I'll live through anything just to be here on this planet. And that's an absolutely valid choice, too. But again, something that you need to think about and have be part of your conversation with your decision makers. So, some of what informs these decisions are like, what are your own experiences with serious illness for yourself or for someone else, who you've been with, who somebody else who was really sick, who is dying, who is at the end of life. The questions about, do you have strong preferences about where you want to be at the end of life? And if you do, then again, that has to be part of the conversation with your decision makers. Part of why I wrote my book, Last Acts of Kindness, is that um, I saw how qualitatively different it was for people who were at the end of life and dying at home, in hospitals, and in facilities. So the book is really just stories about people who I attended in all of those different situations. And sometimes I really encourage people who are in the hospital to have their agents make sure that even the space in the hospital is the kind of space that they want it to be. That for most of us, birth and death are the two most sacred transformations that we make as human beings. And to honor that and not just have it be a maze of machines and wires and tangles, and for your agents to be able to advocate and say, hey, we need to have some space here to create something sacred, because if this person's going to die in the hospital, we need it to be quiet. We need some of the bells and whistles to be turned off. If it's really critical to you that you be at home at the end of life, and again, part of that conversation is about being on hospice, being willing to admit that you're at the end of life, because hospice is a 6-month benefit for all of us. And part of the challenge is that people often don't get referred to hospice in a timely manner, so that they can't develop relationships with that team as your medical team. But when someone really says it's important for me to die at home, they also need to consider what that looks like, because even with a hospice team as your medical team, most people still need 24/7 care, whether it's paid care or friends and family, but you need to understand the resources that are needed for that. And those are either people resources of people who can show up and be at your bedside and take care of you, or financial resources to be able to pay for caregivers to take care of you, because hospice does not provide 24/7 care. For some people, it's a mix of those things. They're able to hire caregivers, like to take care of them at night so that their friends and family can sleep, but that their friends and family are the people who show up during the day. Giovanna was someone who had an amazing circle of people who loved her, who were willing to be there with her 24/7 for those last days of her life. But again, she had a very short end of life time. When she came to my workshop in early November, she came to two of my workshops, actually. One a day long on being with dying, and one was the specific advanced care planning workshop. And she stayed and talked to me afterwards and said, and she was already quite sick, having a really hard time. And she said, so when do you think I should call hospice? And I said, last week. Because she wasn't doing treatment anymore. And I knew she could get a much higher level of care at home if she was on hospice, and she would have comfort measures and just more access to comfort. Luckily, she did hook up with an amazing patient palliative care team in Marin County that was able to provide her with very similar kinds of medical care and concern and treatment that she got in those last few days when she was finally on hospice. Um, which reminds me that one thing that I am now telling everyone to include in their advance directive is to add in a line, no matter what other addendums you put in, and you can put in whatever addendums you want that are important to you, but to make sure that somewhere in your directive you write in that if my care gets complicated, if there are some difficult decisions to be made about which way to go, what kinds of treatments or interventions to do, and it's not being 100% clear to my agents, to my family, that I instruct my agent to request a palliative care consultation in the hospital. Every major hospital in the United States, certainly in California, not in all rural hospitals, but certainly in every urban hospital setting now, pretty much, has an inpatient palliative care team. And palliative care isn't just about end of life. It's a big misunderstanding on the part of most healthcare providers, on the part of most oncologists, I have to say, and on the part of most people, that people equate palliative care and hospice as the same thing. They think palliative care is only about end of life care, when studies across the country have shown us that people who get palliative care concurrently with whatever kinds of cancer treatments they're getting not only live better, but live longer. Because palliative care is really about helping relieve suffering on every level, not just medically, but spiritually, emotionally, psychologically. And it's done by a whole team, not just one doctor, but by doctors, nurses, social workers, chaplains, spiritual care providers. I really think that anyone with a cancer diagnosis should also have a referral to ideally an outpatient palliative care team, but I'm very aware that not everywhere has outpatient palliative care. We're very lucky here in the Bay Area. But certainly, if you're in the hospital and there's any questions or confusion about what to do next, palliative care providers are trained in communication skills. And I have seen many, many times, especially in intensive care situations, that when the care team shows up, they can be the mediator between the patient and the family and the agents and whoever the medical team is. They can help the medical team understand who this person was and what their wishes really were. They can help the family understand the bigger picture of what's going on medically. And often they're the ones who can help bring something to an understanding of what really matters most to that person and what's the best way forward. So I really encourage you to add that into any advance directive, that you request that your agent can request a palliative care consultation if they don't know what to do next. So briefly, what most people want is to be at peace. Most people want to be free from pain, to not have shortness of breath, to not be anxious. Most people say they want touch, although some people say they don't want touch. A lot of people say they want their finances in order. They want to feel like their life was meaningful. It's important that your decision makers, and again, your loved ones, your family, really know, what do you want? What's most important to you? One of the tools that I use that is a fantastic tool for having this part of the conversation is a deck of cards called Go Wish. I thought I had one here, but I'm not going to jump across the room to get it. Go Wish, I think it's .org. It's also listed on the last slide. When I do in-person workshops, we're able to give everyone a deck of Go Wish cards, and we actually play the Go Wish game during the workshop. And even in the online sessions, we do use, I have a spreadsheet of all the Go Wish cards, but it's a deck of cards, and on the back of each card is one wish that might be important to you, either when you have serious illness or at the end of your life. And they have, there are things like to be free from pain, to be free from anxiety, to trust my doctor, to have an advocate who cares, who really knows my wishes. So there's, I think, about 50 cards, maybe not quite that many. And then the way you play it is you go through each card and you make three piles of things that are most important to you, things that are sort of kind of maybe, and the things that really don't matter to you so much. Then you go back to the deck of the things that are most important to you, kind of what you saw on that last slide. And you kind of pick the top 5. And it's often just a way to have a conversation with your agents about not just the technical and mechanical things of, do you want life support? Do you want to be on a breathing machine? Do you want dialysis? But what are the other things that are important, that are really most important to you? Is it to be kept clean and have your dignity? Is it to be able to have your friends and family around you? Is it to be able to die in a peaceful place? So this card game kind of lightens the conversation a little bit. And many, many people have told me that it was the most useful tool for them in creating a meaningful advance directive and in having in-depth conversations with their agents. So what else should your doctor and your decision maker know about you and about your wishes? This is where you get to write in whatever you want. You can addendums to your advance directive. You can create your own advance directive if this particular document doesn't speak to you. In my workshops, I give people a packet of information, even online. It's a digital packet that has samples of different kinds of advance directives. Some of you may have heard of the 5 Wishes document, which is another document that's written in very plain English, not in medicalese or legalese, that helps people think about, well, what things do I need to consider? How comfortable do I be? What kind of pain management do I want? And it even goes into things like, do you want music played for you? What kind? What kinds of things do you want your agents and your family and your loved ones to know about you? How do you want to be remembered? And again, your agent also has the decision-making power, if you give it to them, to make arrangements for what happens after you die. It's also important to put that in writing, because unfortunately I've seen that be one of those critical areas where families get into arguments and crisis, and one person feels strongly about things going one way and somebody else feels strongly about another. And part of why we do this really is this gift of not having chaos at the time of a crisis. When someone's in the hospital is not the time to be thinking about all these things and putting it in writing. When we're feeling okay and we're, just doing our lives, this is the time to have these conversations and to really put things in writing. So what's required to make it a legal document is your signature and date. And then there's 2 ways to officially make it legal. Either you can have it notarized by a notary, or you can have any 2 people witness your signing of it. It can be neighbors, it can be friends, as long as it's not people who are named in your document. I have a friend last week who told me that her neighbors knocked on her door, and she said they're not neighbors who usually she's in close contact with, and they said, we finished our advance directive and handed it to her across the threshold and said, would you and your husband please sign these for us? So in this day and age of COVID and of lockdown, a lot of people trying to deal with the legal issues around this document and on some of the rules and regulations and restrictions. But mostly what I'm being told is that all healthcare systems are going to honor advanced directives right now, even if they're not notarized or even if they're not necessarily signed by two people. If you sign it and put the date, and it's April or May or June in 2020, and you can even put a note that says this was signed in the time of COVID, in the time of lockdown, your wishes will be honored. And at some point, if we can see notaries again, or if you have two people, who you're 6 feet apart from, you can somehow get it to them to sign it. Everything is going to be honored, especially if it's in writing. And again, especially if your agents have had these conversations with you, and if things have been done in this time of COVID, they will be honored a little bit differently. But still, it's important to make it a legal document when we can. And what's most important is what we do with it. What's most important is that you make copies, that you have your copy in an easy to find place, so that if someone in your family, if you end up having to go to the ER and someone in your family needs it, they can find it easily. That whoever are your decision makers have copies of it. I think it's a good idea for, your loved ones, for the people who are going to show up for you if you're really sick, to know what your wishes are. Certainly for your main doctors to have a copy, and for whatever healthcare system that you relate to not only have a paper copy, but that you make sure that at this day that it's scanned into your electronic medical record, and then you double check to make sure that it is scanned in. Photocopies are fine. What's important to understand too is that if you did one 10 years ago, and maybe that's in your medical record, the legal document is the one with the most recent date on it. So if you did one 10 years ago and now you have one that's dated 2020, your most recent one that's considered the legal document. So it's critical to date it. Ideally, if you have old ones, to get rid of the old ones so that there's not confusion about, which one is the current one. But the date is really what matters, and making sure that it's in your medical record. Certainly, there are people working on the idea of having a repository in the cloud for advanced directives. It hasn't quite happened because of HIPAA regulations and everything else, but I'm quite sure that within the next 5 to 10 years, certainly, depending on what else is going on in the world, that we will have ways to have our advanced directives be accessible digitally through the internet. I scanned all my documents into my computer, and then I put them on a thumb drive, which I now carry around in my purse. It says AD, Advanced Directive, on it, so that it could be plugged into any USB port if something happened to me. As we've said, it's totally important to keep your wishes up to date, to review this document. Really, you can change your wishes at any time. If you write something next week and then next month decide, oh, I don't believe that anymore, I want to do something different, you can just tear it up and sign a new one. So again, this changes as you change, but it's important to update it and review it regularly. I hope that you will take the next steps, that you will talk to your family and friends about your healthcare wishes, that you really think about who's the best person in your life to advocate for you, and have these in-depth conversations with those people. Talk to your medical providers. Really ask the right people to be your decision makers, and put your wishes in writing. And as we said, give copies to all the appropriate people. I find that a lot of people who come to my workshop say, oh, yeah, it's been on my to do pile for a long time. And that's true for all of us. It's not an easy thing, although once you do it, it feels like a big weight is lifted off of your shoulders. So I'm really encouraging people these days, especially in the world of COVID, when none of us knows if we start having symptoms, if we're going to end up at the ER, to have thought about this, to have conversations, to have things in place is more important now than ever. um, and just a thank you. And these are some of the resources that hopefully you can copy down. I think we can make these slides available. I don't not 100% sure about that, but certainly we can make these links available for you. The Mary Center at UCSF here in San Francisco is the where I work, the Mary Center for Education and Palliative Care, and on our website it lists all of the various advanced care planning and other kinds of workshops. Right, we also have an ongoing online workshop in resiliency for caregivers. So there's some great tools on that website. And now I want to turn it back, Lisa, to see if more questions have come up. Um, yeah.
Thank you again, Redwing. There were so many things that you said that were just gems throughout the whole piece. First of all, I do want to address the resources. We do have that available. The resources on the last slide, we put all the links on that What Matters Most blog featuring you. So if anyone wants to see those links again in terms of the book, Prepare for Your Care, and the Mary UCSF link, as well as retreats that Redwing has, it's all available on that blog. I wanted to go back and highlight one thing that really impacted me that you said, which is why we do this, right? To minimize this chaos, especially during this time of COVID. I mean, there's so much chaos, and perhaps this is the one thing we could do to help, us have a sense of control during this ever-changing time. And like you said so well, when we're feeling okay physically, when we're not in crisis medically, this is the time to do it and put it in writing. So I do think that, even though this is a chaotic time on the outside, it may be a perfect opportunity for us. There were a couple things that I really liked how you said very practically to copy it and put the advanced directives in an easy to find place. Give it the copies to your decision makers, our doctors, the hospital. And I love your little thumb drive thing. I know for me, I think I mentioned at the very beginning, I have a little pocket card that's laminated that says
Yeah.
we've executed decision makers. We're old school, so this is what was given to us by our lawyer. We've executed advanced directives, and our decision makers have copies of this, and on the back are our names and numbers of our decision makers. And not only does it help if we're unexpectedly in the hospital, it's actually already helped us twice when my husband lost his wallet and they didn't know who to call. So that's another added perk of having names and numbers available in your wallet.
Absolutely. I firmly believe in old school around that, Lisa. And I usually tell people have some kind of wallet card that has the names and contact information of people who can show up and make decisions for you. It's so important. And, in these days, I think having phone numbers, but maybe also having an email for that person is helpful.
Oh, that's great. I love that. I also like how you said right now, especially during COVID, to make it legal doesn't have to be a notarized person, right? It could be two witnesses. Can you speak a little bit more in terms of if there's any requirements for those two witnesses? Do they have to be a certain age,
Oh,
competence?
sure. Yeah, they have to be over 18. And the main thing is that they're not named in your document. So it can't be somebody who's your decision maker or your family. But, it really can be two people off the street. It can be neighbors, just, two people in whatever kind of group you're in. Although again,
Yeah.
these days we're not really meeting in
Yeah.
groups, but it can be any two people. What they are witnessing is that you are who you say you are. So
Mm.
officially, you're supposed to show them your ID the same way you show a notary, and they say, "Yes, you are Lisa Yen," and they sign their names and say, I did talk to someone actually this week who was able to get electronic signatures of two people, witnessing her signing it through Zoom. So people are being very creative, and then she was able to scan those in, and have it be part of her electronic document that then she was able to upload to her medical record. So I think we're all getting a little bit creative about how we do this right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know that if someone were to ask two witnesses to sign, I think, especially if those witnesses have never signed anything like that before, they would wonder, am I going to be called on to verify that I was a witness?
Right. No, no,
Okay.
witnesses are, no, they have no legal responsibility other than just signing their names. It's your agents who are going to be called on. And, and again, all the more important that you really have these conversations and that your agents understand what their role is. That their role isn't to say, oh, I'll do what's best, but to do what you have told
Mhm.
them you would. When I was an ICU nurse, I can't tell you how many times, we would call the person who was listed on someone's document and say, huh? What are you talking about? I never talked to them about this, or I don't want to be the one to pull the plug, because that's what their immediate assumption was, that they'd have to be responsible for something they didn't, because they had never really talked about it with the person who they wrote down as their agent. So that doesn't work.
Okay. And let's speak a little bit more about the agent, which I really love that part that you were talking about. Really clarifying that this should be a person who isn't necessarily the obvious person, not necessarily a spouse or the closest person to you emotionally, because that person might be having a really hard time, but really the
Exactly.
best person who could be the strongest advocate and could follow through, so who can really be objective. So I guess one question that comes up is, if there's someone who's medical in your life, is that a preferred thing, or do they not need to be medical? I get that question a lot.
Right. Right. It's a good question. Um, I don't think there's a clear answer. I think
Mhm.
it's more about your relationship with that person and your ability to trust them in a difficult situation. Yes, certainly having medical background maybe makes things easier. Maybe makes it less complicated for anyone else. Like if you have more than one agent, if there's somebody who has some medical understanding in terms of interpreting what the doctors are saying. You know, on the other hand, I have to tell you, Lisa, that I, I've seen some situations where the medical people who were also the agents kind of got caught up in the medical reality, um,
Mm.
rather than looking at their friend and what was really going on emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, and they were torn
Mhm.
between sort of being seen as a medical professional by the medical team in that
Mhm.
situation rather than being seen as the advocate and friend. And so I just think
Mhm.
it so depends on who the person is and your particular relationship with that person.
Mhm. I think that's very well said. Sometimes the medical person might be the best medical advocate, but they might not be advocating for you in the way that's most meaningful, emotionally, spiritually, and in other ways, relationally.
That's right.
Okay.
I mean, certainly if you have a good friend who's a medical person, write in that your decision makers should contact that person and get their
Mhm.
input, but that they may not be the absolute decision maker, but that you would like to have their input into the situation. I mean, that's the kind of thing about really making this document yours that's different.
Mhm.
You don't have to just fill in the lines. If you want to add an extra line and say, yeah, I want you to call Lisa because she has some medical understanding and talk about this before a final decision is made.
Yeah. And so a question would come up, what if that person, say they're really busy or difference in time change, they're unable or unavailable to make decisions? What if something happens to that person? They're also sick.
So I
Where
think
would,
that it's often why it is important to have more than one decision maker. You know, even if you say one person is your primary decision maker and the other is your secondary, um, you know, sometimes even having, you know, a third option. I think just having one person makes it challenging because, as you say, something could happen to that person. I think it's also nice for the decision makers to feel like they have some support, that they're not just like the person having to make some challenging decisions for someone they love. So I think supporting your decision makers is is a good thing, and having more than one is helpful for that reason as well.
right. And Redwing, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit as to the people who haven't yet had the chance to have an advanced directives or written documentation about durable power of attorney. Who then does it fall on? You mentioned some of the cases
Right.
back in the day that made the news,
Right.
but could you explain a little bit about the order that medical
So
professionals would be called?
yeah, and the order changes and it's slightly different state to state too. But typically, if you have a spouse, it's your spouse, you know, and then it goes to who is considered closest relative. If you have a parent, it's a parent. If you have an oldest child, it's the oldest child. Um, and then I believe it goes to siblings after that in California. Um, so again, if you haven't ever had a conversation about what's important to you with any of those people in your life, um,
Hmm.
it's going to be real for them to advocate. It's going to be hard for them
Hmm.
to understand what to do. And, you know, certainly for a lot of us, our siblings or people, other people in our family are not the ones who we've had these conversations with. Or, you know, I mean, a lot of people have said to me, oh no, you know, my second daughter or my, you know, brother would never do what I want to be done. You know, they
Hmm.
have really ideas about these kinds of things. So if the decision making goes to somebody who has a totally different idea about this than you do, then
Hmm.
you're in trouble. So, you
Right.
know, again, making sure something's in writing is so important for that reason as well, so that the people who are making your decisions are your choices.
Hmm. I know I've been in situations sometimes where the closest person to someone is a girlfriend or fiance or boyfriend, fiance, and they don't have a legal relationship yet.
Exactly.
And so, unless it's in paper, unless it's a legal
That's
document,
right.
you can't legally respect those. And so, one thing I really wanted to touch on is really about this whole area about the complicated care. You mentioned all these. I mean, one thing that I've heard you say before, it's not all black and white, right? It's all this gray. It's,
Mhm.
the what about the feeding and nutrition and blood transfusion surgery? So, how much of that should we really write down beforehand? What do you think?
Honestly, these are the personal questions that if you feel really strongly about something, write it down. You know,
Mm.
we none of us knows exactly which situation we're going to be in. You know, am I going to need the ventilator, or am I going to need dialysis, or, you know, what are the choices that are going to be put forward for me in some particular situation. We can't know what the particular situation is, but we can have a general idea of the bigger picture of what we would and wouldn't tolerate. And
Mm.
I think as you think through these things, you have more in-depth conversations with, you know, people who love you, with other people in, in a support group to like set aside time to have these conversations of, well, what kind of treatments would you be willing to have, so that it's just a more open conversation, because
Mhm.
we're all going to have different ideas about specifics of what we're willing to tolerate and what we're not. um, but we can't know everything.
Yeah. So speaking of ventilators and these personalized decisions, there is a viewer who really wanted to hear a little bit about what made you change your mind recently about your own personal advance directives in terms of what you were talking about ventilators.
Honestly, what made me change my mind is that when I pictured myself in an intensive care unit, having to be hooked up to a ventilator, I realized it was just absolutely not something I wanted anymore in my life. I'm 67 years old, and although I imagine myself living for quite a long time because I feel great right now and I feel healthy, um, if I were really with that sick, my lungs weren't working and my heart wasn't working well because my lungs weren't working well, then I would want to accept that that means it's my
Mm-hmm.
time at my
Mm-hmm.
end of life. And I would rather be at home in a peaceful place surrounded by people I love than in a hospital.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for sharing all your wisdom. I think that we all hope that we get to a place. I mean, that's our hope, that we have clarity in terms of our own decisions, that we can have the kind of calm and peace that you seem to about your own decisions. Um, and I was just wondering, in the 30 seconds or so, if you have any closing comments.
Really just that I want to encourage people to take the risk of having these difficult conversations, because it's going to be an incredible gift, not just to yourself, but to everyone who loves you, to have these kinds of things understood and in place, um, so that we, your the time in your life that's closer to the end of your life can be meaningful, to can be the kind of peaceful or spiritual experience that you need it to be, and that the people who love you will honor you. And I just think we're privileged to be able to even consider this and write down how we might want things to be at the end of our lives. People in many situations all over the world don't have that privilege, don't have that ability. And even now, in the time of COVID, many people, because the rest of the there's no time to really think about, oh my god, what would I want, how would I want things to be. And so it's a privilege to do this, um, but it's also a responsibility of ours to
Mm.
to have difficult conversations. And I just firmly believe that the more each of us comes to terms with our impermanence, with the fact that we are all mortal beings, it makes every moment of our lives more precious and
Mm.
and more meaningful.
Right.
That we're aware that we're here for a short time, and let's make the most of this time that we
Mm.
have here together.
Right. And thank you for sharing all that. I mean, that's really why we're doing this, right? We're doing something that may not be pleasant in the moment, so that we can savor the time we have, so we can really savor and define and savor those things that matter most. And so thank you so much, Redwing. Thank you, Rich from TVP Live. And just as we enter this, this is not the end of the discussion. This is just the beginning. We invite you to explore with us what matters most to you. And it's not just for end of life and critical times in the hospital. It's also a discussion that will help you in guiding your own NET specific treatments with our NET specialists, who we might be meeting with in the clinic and deciding on treatment, and on treatment sequencing, which is going to be our July monthly webinar with Dr. Eric Liu. The topic of sequencing NET treatments. So definitely talking about what matters most will help in that sequencing. We just want to remind you again, next month's meeting is going to be our annual conference on Saturday, June 20th, 2020. This video for today's meeting will be available on our YouTube channel later this week, and we invite you to follow us on all our social media channels, including Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Make sure you're signed up on our mailing list to get emails about upcoming events and helpful resources. Thank you again, Redwing, Rich, and TVP Live. Have a good day and be well. Bye-bye.